Let's see. I first met Terry in 1973, and I was training in another martial art. I went down to New York City, and actually more or less by accident walked into this Aikido school, and it was the 18th Street Dojo in New York City, and there are all sorts of people playing, and on the mat was this huge guy. And what's funny is Terry wasn't that tall. He was barely 6 feet tall. But he's big built, you know, about 260, 280. But he seemed a lot bigger than anybody else on the mat. And he had a kind of, he just drew your attention because he didn't do Aikido the way most everybody else did. Most everybody else had a very mannered style. They would start to do a move, and they were almost posing. And Terry had a kind of relaxation. It was very heavy. It was sort of like his whole body would relax, and the person on the end was like a towel in his hand, and they would just sort of slam and simultaneously slap down to the mat. It was just very striking. I think that day I didn't meet him. He was just one of the many people on the mat. But as it happened, about a month later, I joined the only Aikido school in New Haven, Connecticut, and they affiliated with the 18th Street Dojo. And Yamada Yoshimitsu Sensei sent up 2 people to teach, and one of them was Terry. So he started coming up every Tuesday evening, as I recall, in his pickup truck, and got to know him that way. You know, my first impression was he's a wild man, you know, but not out of control wild. There was it's just this big, hairy troll of a man dressed in a skirt. Because, you know, you look at, I'd never seen Aikido before, and there's this guy he's got the white keikogi on, but he's got the hakama, you know, the pleated sort of trouser skirt that you wear, and just the contradiction there. And he had a kind of delight the way he was training, and it was right on the edge of an evil, nasty delight, because he was throwing people so hard, and yet they weren't getting hurt. It was like all the tension in their body was blowing out their pores, and then when he would be thrown, if the person was at all incautious in what they were doing, instead of him just sort of lying there and taking the fall, he'd be reaching up, grabbing for their balls or something like that. You know, just basically, you're always on, you never let your guard down. And he was having, and particularly that day, I remember, he was having so much fun. And so that was the first impression, you know, that just this guy who was chewing his way through life. That's the first thing I remember of him. Yeah.
That's great. Did you know him well?
Yeah, I did. So he started coming up to, I did know Terry pretty well for some years, really. He started coming up to New Haven, and I was this painfully sincere young man who wanted to do martial arts and all of that. And for whatever reason, he saw something in me. And I remember one day after I'd thrown myself at him to take proper ukemi for him and all that, and, you know, got thrown all over the place, he sort of said, "Hey, I got my eye on you. You know, if you come down to New York, be happy to teach you." And in the beginning, it was, you know, he was like, I don't know, somewhere between a father and a big brother kind of figure. I started going down to New York City to the Bond Street Dojo pretty much every weekend. Well, I was still in college at the time. And I would go down on a Friday night and stay till Sunday, you know, have some place to stay. A lot of times I slept on the mat. And Bond Street was a world all its own. In New York at that time, there were only a few Aikido schools. There was the 18th Street Dojo, which was like this martial arts mecca. I mean, there were all these different people with all kinds of different styles. And then there was Bond Street, which was right off the Bowery. And the landlord was an old character actor who played Ming the Merciless in the old Flash Gordon movies. And And the dojo was run by two guys, Terry and a guy named Ken Nissen, who still teaches in California. And Ken has a very, very graceful style, very smooth. And then there was Terry. And they were not only physically, but personality-wise, a mix. They'd be fighting on the mat. They'd be arguing on the mat, you know, half the time. And they were best buddies, you know, the rest of the time. And the dojo had a small group of people, maybe 12 regular students, and I sort of just found myself fitting into the dojo. So I was down there a lot, and then after I graduated school, I moved down to New York City, and for a while I had an apartment, and then I was living in the dojo, and I did that for probably about 9 months, just slept on the mat. And, so yeah, I got to know Terry pretty well. I was pretty much in his pocket half the time, you know, just following him around. He confounded every possible image I had of what a martial arts teacher was supposed to be. You know, you had these fantasies of this inscrutable Japanese person who hid their emotions, and Terry was emotion personified. You know, anything that was going on in Terry, you knew, for better and for worse. And the Japanese teachers, some of them go off the rails, to be fair, true, but you know, usually they try to keep their personal life apart from the dojo. At least that's the assumption. Terry's personal life was the dojo. You know, it was like there was no sort of admixture. It's like what went on in the mat went on the mat, so to speak, and also off the mat. And so we were this small, really eccentric community of people. It was a day was an interesting day. There was no day that was just sort of, gee, I'm going to the dojo and I'll work out and nothing else is going to happen. Something was going to happen, either on the mat or afterwards when we went out bar hopping or whatever afterwards. It was really an exciting time. Terry is one of these people who had discrete periods in his life, you know, from when he was a kid, his period where he was sort of sent away to the Deerfield Academy, and he had some wonderful friends that he kept his whole life from that period. And then in Japan, you know, he hung out with a lot of martial arts guys and a lot of women, you know, was pretty much it. Then I knew him in New York, and Terry just got around. I mean, there was basically the dojo, but, you know, he was making money any way he could, all legal, definitely. But, you know, like he'd use his pickup truck to move somebody from one house to another. I remember one time he moved Ultraviolet, who was one of the Andy Warhol actresses. And so he got to be friends with her, and then he met these other people connected with that scene. You know, or he'd meet somebody from uptown, and all of a sudden some people from uptown might come by the dojo or something like that, or, you know, he'd be off for a while. So I never knew everybody he met. I remember that he started trying to hook in with some people who were doing parapsychological research associated with ki and things like that. I can't remember any names, but I know there were these people who were really doing different kinds of research, sort of whether you'd call it on the cutting edge or off the edge of science. So he had that whole crowd that he was sort of hanging out with. And then after I went to Japan and then he moved to San Francisco, then there was a whole other group of folks that I don't know too much about. Yeah, but yeah, that's...
Was he sincere in what he was doing? Did he walk his talk?
You know, that's a funny question. The question, was he sincere? Did he walk his talk? As well as any human being could, and that wasn't very good. And what I mean by that is Terry was anything but a saint. He passionately believed that Aikido was a medium as well as a metaphor for the reconciliation of conflict in this world. And I think he believed it more than anybody I've ever met. he certainly believed it more than any of the Shihan I met in Japan or elsewhere, some of whom were wonderful human beings and saw Aikido as good for all sorts of reasons. But Terry really believed it was a means of world transformation. And yet he was anything but a religious figure. He didn't see himself as a messiah or anything like that. It's just he wanted the word to get out about Aikido. And so he passionately believed that. And I think he believed it with such heat because he struggled so much with it himself. Terry very often was a very angry man. He struggled in personal relationships. His childhood was he had a really rough time growing up. And so what he personally struggled with, he saw Aikido as the answer, and then he extended that to all of humanity. At the same time, he fully retained his feet of clay. And I found that less of a contradiction than I would for many people, because he wasn't sanctimonious in the least. You know, he's like, I'm just a guy, I do these things, but that doesn't change the message. Whereas what I saw with a lot of people, both in the martial arts and you certainly see it in religion, is I'm going to pretend to be this really wonderful, perfect figure and condemn other people for not being. And then, of course, you find out what's going on behind closed doors. With Terry, there were no closed doors. He was a screw-up sometimes in personal relationships. He was a mean bastard at times. But the sincerity doesn't change, and what he was hoping to accomplish didn't change.
I remember him talking about being impeccable. I never quite understood what he meant by that. Do you understand that?
Yeah, Terry tended to mix up a couple things. The question is, Terry used to talk about being impeccable, and what did he mean by that? Terry, I think, like a lot of people who studied Japanese martial arts, sometimes confused the image with the reality. And the Japanese samurai was supposed to be a person who in his own way was seamless, without flaws. Now that doesn't mean a perfect moral human being, but true to whatever code that the samurai was supposed to have. In other words, the code of service, that ethics was behaving impeccably, perfectly, in regard to the orders you were given, or according to whatever Bushido demanded. Now the truth of the matter is the samurai, like most warrior cults, had a code which they violated all the time. And Terry, on one hand, knew that, but on the other hand, had this image of a warrior without flaws. And that was sort of part of his own, I don't know if you call it his fantasy life or his ideal image of what he wanted to be. And I think one of the things that might have, I'm only guessing here because this isn't something we've talked about, but that might have tormented him is anytime he had a personal failing, it was a failure of this image of impeccability. Yeah. I also say that it probably was confounded with all the Don Juan, Carlos Castaneda stuff, which was being talked about, you know, all of in those days. And, you know, they talked about, I think, the impeccable warrior, the perfect warrior. And of course, if you read some of the exposés on Carlos Castaneda these days, you know, what do you got? But anyway, that was his image, that there was an ability to be, as one of Terry's other phrases was, to be beyond love and grief, which he asserted. I never found that phrase anywhere else, but he asserted was a phrase from some samurai code. And the truth of the matter is, I think Terry wanted that so he wouldn't be hurt. But he didn't want it, because Terry, like all of us, very much wanted to be loved. And he loved with a lot of passion, too. You know, he very much wanted his friends. He very much wanted his lovers and all of that. So on the one hand, you have, if I was beyond love and grief, I'd be free from all of this, right? But he didn't want to really be free. I mean, in that sense, the world's too sweet, you know? Yeah.
If you were here now, what would you tell him? What would you ask him? What would you say? You don't have to repeat the question.
What would I say to Terry? You want to go get a beer? But he didn't like to drink that much. So And I'm not being, you know, I don't even know. I After I left for Japan, Terry and I had a correspondence, and it was before email. And Terry was one of the last people that I had in my life that we corresponded by letter. And sometimes they were long, you know, 3-4 page letters. And you write, when you write by hand or even type, it's different from email. You put more time into it because you can't. It's too much to erase it, you know, and you don't want to scribble over your letters. So you actually put some thought into it. So we had some real correspondence going back and forth, and then we met really only 3-4 times in the years after that. I came back to America in 1988, and we had maybe 3 or 4 meetings. But honestly, it was just like picking up the conversation. So it wasn't like anything was ever unsaid. Where I just see him now, hey Terry, what's up? And then we just start talking where we left off the last time.
Did your impression of Terry change? Did he change over the years?
Well, my impression of Terry changed as I got to know him. You know, the first impression I had of Terry, as I described, you know, is almost like the adolescent boy's fantasy of the pirate, the guy who just doesn't care. He can do whatever he wants, and he's not worried if he gets in trouble doing it. And, you know, for a young man, it's like, you know, wow, there's nothing more cool than that. As I got to know him, and I knew that, in fact, he cared a lot, not only about Aikido, you know, and you know, this mission, you know, that there's a way out of the, you know, a world of conflict, but he was just like any other human being in his desires, although his desires were massive. You know, he loved to eat, he loved women, and he was a gluttonous, lustful man, and I think that's damn cool. It wasn't, you know, 7 deadly sins be damned. I mean, he really lived well, and yet he was his own worst enemy in terms of his own mission. Because sometimes, thinking from a Buddhist perspective, out of desire, he would go for something or someone that would undermine a direction that he was going to go. And in addition, sometimes Terry had an intolerance of other people's weakness. And I see that in people who cannot stand their own weakness, can't stand their own fear. And sometimes he would get on the mat, and if somebody was strong enough to hang with him, and you know, he'd really be pushing you, and you'd get something out of it. But if for whatever reason somebody got on the mat and Terry saw a weakness which he thought he was helping, he might push the person beyond their ability to endure. And I mean that psychologically as well as physically. And I think that really undermined his ability to pass on what he wanted to pass on. Because Terry could create enormous excitement when he taught, but when he was at a place too long and things got more familiar, those kind of issues would come up, that intolerance. Now, what changed was when Terry got sick. And Terry was misdiagnosed, as I recall, with something called sarcoidosis, which is an autoimmune disorder. And he was dosed for a long time with high doses of cortisone, which made things terribly worse, both in terms of obesity and actually affected him mentally. This incredibly florid, distraught depressions that he underwent. And then they finally diagnosed him properly, far too late, and he had an obstruction of his pulmonary vein. And what happened was Terry had to either be broken or accept the fact that he was a frail being himself. And he did the latter. And I remember he wrote to me one time how he was on a street and hanging onto a wall because he had no breath, and some young tough saw him and started giving him the eye, and all he could do was pray that they would leave him alone because he knew he couldn't do anything about it if they chose to hurt him. And it was at that point that Terry really achieved something that on a fundamental level he had lacked before, which is compassion for people who were frail. He could talk that talk very well, and love and peace and harmony, but he was a big man who could basically either flow with what was coming his way or smash it flat. But when he no longer could do that, then he could actually appreciate the way most people live their lives, which in truth he was living before himself. He just didn't want to face it. And I think he really became a teacher of his Aikido after he became ill. Yeah.
Wow, that's something to see.
Yeah. Yeah, God, I wish he were still alive, but the illness was a blessing in terms of what he wanted to be as a teacher. Yeah.
What principles do you think he lived by? What were his main principles?
What principles did Terry live by? You've probably heard the cliche about in neurology that human beings have three brains: the human brain, the mammal brain, and the lizard brain. And Terry lived by all three. Sometimes, he was in pure reptilian fight-flight, usually fight in his case. Sometimes it was just something warm for his belly and something warm for his body, pure mammal. And other times he was trying to be the epitome of humanity. And to me, the epitome of humanity is someone who lives in this world and is trying to communicate what is finest in himself or herself to other people. I really can't tolerate spiritualism and trying to not be in this world. We're going to find out what's not in the world after we die. And so I don't have much interest for that. And honestly, Terry had admiration for what he perceived as like spiritual people. But he wasn't, and God bless him for it. The principle that he lived by at his best was what he believed he learned from Ueshiba Morihei, the founder of Aikido, that there is a way to live with other people which doesn't cause them either fear or oppression, and doesn't cause you to be either in a state of fear or oppressed. That there's a place that people can actually live together in mutual respect and ensuring the dignity of each of you. And that was the principle he really struggled for. And at his best, that's where he got.
Do you think he had inner peace?
Did Terry have inner peace? I can't speak for his last days. I wasn't there. When I knew him, no. Terry not only struggled with the things I've talked about already, in terms of his fears, struggle with aggression, he also struggled because he didn't believe on some core level that he deserved accolades. I don't know if I have the story exactly right, but the way I remember being told the story was one time he got hooked up in this human potential movement thing, corporate trainings. You can pull in some big bucks on a weekend teaching a group of business executives, principles of Aikido or something like that. And he finally got hooked in the mojo wire. I mean, it looked like this training he was going to give was going to be the start of something big. He would not have to worry financially ever again. And I think he was due to get $5,000 for one day's presentation. He gets up in front of the audience and he looks out in what he described as a sea of gray flannel, and he went absolutely numb. He stared and he goes, "Gentlemen, I just realized I have nothing worthwhile to say." And he walked off. And that was Terry over and over again. I was told that in 1964, when Tohei Koichi, who was at that time the head of teaching at Hombu Dojo, was going to America to teach, and Terry was training a lot with Tohei at that time, that he said to Terry, "You want America? I'll give you America." This is before the Japanese teachers were coming over. "You want America? I'll give you America." he could have been on the ground floor. He could have been the man, so to speak. And he said, I'm not ready for anything like that. Now, in that case, he wasn't. But it is also illustrative of something where when people gave him admiration, on the one hand, he, like most people, certainly craved it. But the other hand, he had to break it. He had to undermine it because he couldn't. It's like, if he accepted it, then he has to maintain it. And every day he has to maintain impeccability. And he'd really have to maintain it because now he's been set up by other people to be there. And it was just intolerable. I mean, he had a kind of humility, which is not humility. It was almost masochism. I remember we were in Japan, and we got taken out to eat by some people. And this place was famous for its beef stew. I was telling Terry about what great beef stew this guy. He used to be the chef at the Imperial Hotel. And one of the guys there says, they have wonderful fried oysters. Fried oysters are incredible. Terry, you've got to have the fried oysters. And Terry was deathly allergic to oysters. And he looks at me and goes, what else can I do? And so he ordered the oysters. He didn't say, I'm allergic. He had this idea that, you know, somehow when he was in Japan, you know, that the way he'd survived in Japan was basically by melding in, by going along as best he could. And this would be an example of it. And he ate the oysters and got deathly sick for a couple days. And it had this, whatever you call it, it had the best intentions. In that Terry was, I think, yes, this original question was about inner peace. And Terry was really, I believe, saying, unless I know it for myself, I can't accept it from anybody else. And if you're going to put me into that straitjacket of, you're up here on a pedestal, you're a special guy, then I'm going to have to destroy it, because if I don't know it inside, then it's false to the core, and I can't accept that. So beyond the level of, if you will, masochism, if you call it that, it actually came from a place of personal integrity. Without inner peace, I can't be set up as a man who has it.
Great insights.
Yeah.
What was his strengths and what were his weaknesses? I mean, really extreme ones.
They actually, the question of what were his strengths and weaknesses, they actually were the same. Actually were the same. Because to me, Terry's strength and weakness was his passion. He couldn't do things by half measures. He couldn't love by half measure. He couldn't hate by a half measure. If he had an enemy, that person was really an enemy. But because of that, he had the wherewithal to actually be righteous in his condemnation of people. He wasn't compelled to be stuck in the middle saying, well, I can see their side. You know, if a person deserved hating in his eyes, they were hated. Now, the downside of that is, what if they really didn't deserve it or whatever? So that's what I mean, that his strength was also his weakness. Terry, technically, if you go back to Aikido, was not that good. I mean, he had a couple things down very well. He had the ability to relax this immense, massive body from tension to relaxation, just like that. So it just would drop. And that was, marvelous. Technically speaking, he had a couple techniques, Irimi Nage, Ikkyo and Shiho Nage. Those were good. His other techniques wasn't all that good. Okay, so it was that ability, though, to, if you will, drop into movement, to move quickly through relaxation as opposed to tension, that made his Aikido really excellent. But there are a lot of people who moved as well or better than him, but that passion that he could actually excite people who otherwise would not be at all interested in either Aikido or particularly in terms of harmony. You know, it's one thing if you have this little pencil-neck person sort of talking about how it's good that we all get along and peace and love and Aikido is the embodiment of this and blah, blah, blah. And you look at the person and you say, well, you have to say that. But when you have this massive human being who could actually scare you when you walk in the room, and he's saying the only valid martial art is love, and you're like, what? And to see him say that, and he wasn't mouthing it, it was absolutely his conviction. And he had this little rap, which, you know, he'd say, if you define self-defense, you have to ask the question, what is the self? And the self is only whole, the self is only complete when it's in a state of love. And you're saying, that's not the kind of love I thought he was talking about, because then he'd whip, you know, this heavy-duty technique on somebody, and he said, that's what I'm talking about. And he would just excite people's imagination by that. And the only reason he could excite people's imagination is that was not lip service to him. Despite anything else I might have said or other people might have said, that he believed with absolute conviction.
Do you have a favorite story?
Oh man, now I got to think. But we got a lot of tape. Do I have a favorite story? Huh. Geez, I'm stuck. Let me think for a minute and see if I can think of a favorite story for Terry Dobson.
Well, I wanted to ask about a story anyway. You know the story about him and Kanai and the Ofudo and O-Sensei? Did you hear about that?
No,
That, O-Sensei asked him to get into the Ofudo first, and Terry, being the obedient Deshi, goes, okay, and he gets in, and Kanai just explodes with anger, because Terry went in there first. And O-Sensei cracked up. He just thought that was funny. You know? And I've heard many interpretations to that, and so I was going to ask you for yours.
Okay, so do I need to repeat the story, or?
Go ahead.
Okay. What you just asked me about is a story which actually I hadn't heard of, but see, there was this transmission of knowledge which was passed down actually before Aikido in Daitoryū, that the disciples of Takeda Sokaku attended to him and would actually have to make his bath, would have to attend him where he went here and there. Now, interestingly, Takeda Sokaku really didn't care much about the temperature of the bath water, from what everybody said, so it was easier. But there are all these stories about that, and actually Ueshiba talked about having to do something that he made his students do, which was when they'd travel, Ueshiba would have to carry all the bags. And Takeda would be zigzagging through the train station, and Ueshiba's trying desperately to keep up with him. And Ueshiba made his deshi do that. That's not an Aikido story. That goes back another generation. And Ueshiba was asked one time, did you ever lose a fight? And it's in John Stevens' new book. I think it's called The Secrets of Aikido. And he says, yeah, one time I lost. I was following Takeda Sensei in the train station, and I got tangled up, and I almost lost him at the train station, which is exactly what O-Sensei's, Ueshiba's Deishi used to say as well. So another thing that would happen is, allegedly, Ueshiba was incredibly sensitive as a human being, you know, because of either his higher spiritual thing or because he's a crotchety old man, I don't know. But you couldn't touch the bath water to figure out what temperature it was, because oil from your skin would get in the bath. But you had to know exactly right. And if it was exactly right, Ueshiba was pleased with you. If not, he was anything but pleased. Now, why would you have this teaching other than it being just an autocratic, demanding old man? You're studying sensitivity, to be absolutely aware of what another person desires, what they need, is a skill that conceivably can branch off in all sorts of avenues. You can be aware of other people. You can apply that, if you will, to combat, that you're reading somebody in a second by microsecond basis. That's the logic of that kind of training. So the story goes that Ueshiba was having his bath made by Kanai Sensei, and Terry was a junior to Kanai. And Kanai was a very, very serious man. He tried to be the perfect follower. And they were both young then at that time, of course, and so the bath is made, and Ueshiba says to Terry, you get in the bath first. And he does, and at which point Kanai is, so the story goes, absolutely livid with rage, and Ueshiba, this old man, is just breaking up laughing. And so what's the meaning of the story? And so, like anything else, people have all sorts of interpretations of this. The crudest meaning would be Ueshiba was laughing that a foreigner would be so stupid because, you make an offer, and then, of course, the Deshi is supposed to refuse, and Terry just went right ahead. Honestly, the way I read the story, knowing what I know about this, the characters involved, is that Ueshiba was just messing with everybody's head. And Terry, of course, didn't understand that he should have, demurred and all of that. And certainly, if he was going to be forced into the bath by Sensei, it should have taken a number of demands. But Ueshiba was also just enjoying, the spectacle of a student who was totally discomfited by something outside his narrow sort of range of vision. In that sense, there are enough stories that Ueshiba did sometimes teach by paradox like that he would set people up. And sometimes teachers do that because they can. There can be, this so-called, in American Indian tradition, they call coyote teaching, and there's something psychopathic about this because a lot of times teachers' depredations can be rationalized as crazy wisdom, as it's called in Tibet, or coyote wisdom. Like Chogyam Trungpa was a flaming alcoholic, and his students were feeding him alcohol by the glassful as he was dying, and they were saying the alcohol, according to what Trungpa had told them, so I've read, that the alcohol was what kept him in this world. Otherwise, he was so spiritual he would, waft away, and the alcoholism killed him. Anything can be rationalized by that, but at the same time, there is such a thing as paradoxical teaching, and I think that Ueshiba, by and large, stayed on the right, and I just pointed to the left, but stayed on the right side of that equation. That, it's like, okay, you have this perception of me, well, I'm going to mess with that a little bit. Yeah?
You think Terry used it?
He tried, but the problem is Terry was conscious of it. Here I am trying to do crazy wisdom or something like that. It's like many years ago I read a haiku by Basho, and it was something like this. Basho's describing the Enlightenment experience, and it's something like frog in a well, plop.
I know that.
Right? And it's like at the moment the frog hits the water, boom, you're enlightened. And for years afterwards, I would be walking past a pond, and every time I heard a frog drop in the water, is it now? Is it happening? And that's the problem with too much knowledge, And so the same way, every once in a while, Terry would try to put somebody through something like that. But the other hand, if you're trying to do it, you're kind of pretentious, and he wouldn't do that much. I think sometimes it might have looked like that, but it was just Terry being Terry, as opposed to much teaching.
He used to grab me so hard I couldn't do time ankle. Did he do it?
He would grab as hard as he could, yeah. You're saying he'd grab you so hard you couldn't move, like in a turn.
Could,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
tears would be springing out of my face.
Yeah. And that kind of, in martial arts training, there's two kinds of ways of being hurt. There is when you're injured and when something hurts, but it's not really injuring you. And personally, I think that unless a person is somehow wounded psychologically, so that they really shouldn't be on the mat with you to begin with, and they should be going through something therapeutic first or something to make themselves strong enough to handle this, that when you are hurt in the service of training, I don't consider that a negative. And being grabbed so hard you can't move, which you're frustrated, it's also teaching you that there's a proper way that you, even though you're grabbed that hard, you still can move.
Yeah. I wasn't complaining, I was just wondering.
No. So I just chose an opportunity to get on a soapbox. But yeah, he would grab as hard as he could, and in the beginning, hell, I couldn't move. Yeah. And then, or it's like he'd be, the Shomanuchi, and he had eyes like runny eggs. It's like and they'd be sort of half popping out of his head. And his shomanuchi would be coming from here, and it's like he's almost headbutting you at the same time, right? And and he didn't have much of a neck because his shoulders would be up here, and he'd just get coming through like this. And how are you going to do like an arm lock on him, right? And it used to just frustrate the hell out of me. You just want to pop him one before he hits you. So there are a couple techniques like that, But really the message there is, if the person's really if you can do Aikido, you have to be able to handle an attack with integrity, right? And that he gave. Yeah.
What do you remember? What's your favorite memory of him? What's your one scene?
It's not a scene. My favorite memory of him is being thrown. I remember the early days when I was first learning, and I'm kind of a big guy, and Terry just had this broad back, and particularly say like an Ushido technique. I remember that when I tried to grab him around the neck or something like that. And when he would catch the technique right, I just felt like this little kid, and this huge back. I'd be on the back, and then I'd be off the back, and then I'd be flying through the air, and I'd be, how the hell did that happen? And I'd have such altitude. And I just remember that there were times when I was being thrown so hard, and I didn't have any adrenaline, any fear. It was just one of the most wonderful experiences of my life. And that's the one. And then the second, I just remembered it, which was my favorite story, and it's good because I win. So I went to Japan, and I started doing other martial arts. And I was doing this, I started training very seriously in a martial art called Aikido, which, among other things, has some grappling. And I came back to Bond Street, the prodigal son returns and all that. And so Terry decided to give me a bunch of grief. And he's like, so what do you know? I got nothing, Terry. He goes, come on, let's work out. And so he just started attacking me, and first trying to do some Aikido, so doing it in those days. And so he's neutralizing everything. He says, that's all you got? That's all you got? And, knocking me down and all this. And I'm getting more and more pissed off. And somehow, let's see, I think I took him in a leg sweep. And he gets down on his hands and knees, and I sort of jumped on his back. And he's like laughing because I'm kind of high on his shoulders. And I got on him a technique in judo. It's called a juji gatame. It's basically you scissors the person's shoulders with your legs. And he's on his hands and knees. And I start to drop backwards into this juji. And out of his mouth comes, oh no, this high-pitched little sound. And I put the arm lock on him. And I wasn't going to let go until he tapped at least 3 times. That I'll never forget.